Hey everybody, how's it going? Dan Shinder here on Drum Talk TV with Drumming Injury Talk with our new hostess, co-host, main host. I'm the co-host because I don't really know what's going on here. Janice Ying from Los Angeles. Welcome, December
Hey,
1st. How
thanks.
are you?
I'm great. How are you? I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you so much. Nadia is on a sabbatical, those of you who've been following the show. And Janice is not only a physical therapist, not only the owner of Opus Physical Therapy, which I have something to talk about in a moment, but she's also a musician, right? You're like a world class violinist, pianist, bagpipe player, beer
Ah,
bonger. Like, what's your deal?
uh, yeah. So my
Some of
background is
that's true.
in,
People have to guess which.
yeah, it's like two truths and a lie, right? Like, which I think they can pretty easily guess which one.
I
Um,
hope so.
and coincidentally, I don't like the bagpipes that much. Don't tell anyone, but
Oh,
that's
the only thing I don't like about bagpipes is I always get like a filling that comes out, well, like back in. But you're a
Yeah,
physical therapist. You own
I'm a
Opus Physical
PT.
Therapy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a
Big.
musician turned PT, and I always tell people that, I kind of took the scenic route to get to where I am right now. But my background and kind of growing up, my all my aspirations were to become a professional pianist. I played violin also at a pretty high level, and so I did both piano and violin performance in college. Although my degree is, they would only let me do one. I couldn't do a double performance degree. So I got my degree in piano performance. But yeah, so how I ended up becoming a PT, just because that's such a far cry from doing playing and performing music, is that I actually got injured playing the violin, kind of starting from like late high school, and then it just kind of manifested into something bigger
Wow.
in kind of like the early half of my college career. So I ended up getting shoulder surgery on my left side.
Wow. That part
Yeah,
we've talked a lot and I didn't remember that or know
yeah.
that.
I
Wow.
don't think I don't think it came up in conversation, but really that was kind of like the trigger that prompted me to kind of go down the path of physical therapy, because I was a PT dropout. I was a PT flunky.
Oh,
Um,
wow. Really?
and yeah, I mean, part of my struggle and part of the reason why I am so passionate about caring for musicians is because as I was going through the process of dealing with my injury, it's just that I, first went to my teachers to see if they could help give me any advice on like what I could change, what I could do to, lessen the
And they probably
lessen the
didn't have any,
pain.
right?
They didn't have much, and it's not their fault. I really don't fault them, because it's, I mean, at
A
the
lack
time,
of
and even
knowledge. That's all.
even then, even now, like a lot of musicians don't know a lot about the anatomy or how we use our bodies to do our art and play our instruments.
Right.
But then when I went to the doctors, the people who are supposed to know about our bodies and everything, they couldn't wrap their heads around what I did as a musician, right? And
Yeah.
so I got, kind of generic exercises and stuff. And I was a pretty healthy and active high schooler at the time, or, college student. So it wasn't that I wasn't strong, but I just wasn't using my body correctly, and my setup wasn't correct. So that was what was contributing to it. So I saw this huge void, kind of in between my music peers and colleagues, and then the professionals who were supposed to know how to treat these conditions. And so really my mission in my career that I've been a PT now for coming on almost 14 years now.
Wow.
And so my whole career has been dedicated to trying to bridge that gap, so to speak.
I love that because you put it so eloquently where musicians don't know the physical ramifications and really you know, the compromises that we face physically,
Yeah.
and the professionals in that area don't really understand what compromises we put ourselves in as musicians. So it's
Yeah.
interesting how those two worlds come together. And even though this is called drumming injury talk, whether you play drums, guitar, piano, saxophone, violin, bagpipes, anything, repetitive motion or certain just postures or incorrect postures, I see so many drummers just speaking to that one area of musicianship that set up so, even though it's subjectively, there are so many drummers that set up incorrectly, if I could put it that way, as far as their ergonomics for their body type, where their seat is. Are their knees higher than their waistline? Are they sitting too high? Do they have things too far of a reach that are set up for show, but not
Yeah.
physically, smart? And
Yeah.
like you pointed out, you had to have shoulder surgery as a violinist. I could think of every instrument where our physicality is compromised. So,
Yes.
folks, chime in no matter what instrument you play. Chime in with comments, questions. Do you have arthritis, tendonitis, bursitis, shoulder pain, hips, displacement of hips? I had that for a while till I changed my setup. Any
Hmm.
joint issues, sciatica, things like that, no matter what instrument you play. And Janice will chime in with, well, here's why, or here's what you might want to try. It's fascinating to me how, as musicians, we're kind of blind. There's this big black thick curtain, and we don't pay attention to that. We just want to have fun. We just want to play music and set up the way we see our heroes set up, which might
Yeah.
not be right for us. Like I'm okay, so now I'm 60, 5'7", used to be 5'8". My posture and my size is so different from when I started playing at 7 years old, shortly before I
Hmm.
was 7. And sure, my setup and my posture has morphed over time. But if I look at the last 10 to 20 years, my body has changed, my setup has changed, and it wasn't always right for me until I learned
Yeah.
about this stuff. And we need to be aware of that because you can self create some serious injuries, whether it's in our joints or nerve pain, reoccurring muscle injuries. So, can you, as a physical therapist, Janice, talk about that a little bit? And when we don't pay attention to the physical signs and what would those be, that we face as musicians and especially drummers, what can happen and what should we watch for in our pain, whether it's nerve, muscle, delayed pain and injuries where, hey, maybe we need to change some things in our setup, or also how can we do preventative maintenance and how can we repair what's happening based on the wrong things we're doing. I
So
know
how
there's
long
so
do we
much in
have?
that,
Like,
but yeah.
no, I'm just kidding. Well, I will say, kind of backtracking a little bit, and I'm happy to say that I've been in the music health world for quite some time now, and even before I became a full-fledged PT, I was still interested in this area, and I'm happy to say that my perception is that musicians' awareness of their bodies has definitely increased over time, and people are definitely within like the last, I would say, like 5 years or so, really start to pay attention more to
Is that
things. And
generational or across all ages?
I think it could be
Okay.
generational. That's my sense of it too. And I work with a lot of young kind of up and coming musicians. So part of my one of my roles in addition to having my PT clinic is I teach a musician wellness course at the Colburn School Conservatory. So I teach all the undergrad and graduate students who come through there a whole semester on how to just be healthy. And so that's physical health, hearing health, mental health, nutrition, sleep, etc. Um, but so a lot more students who have been coming through these last few years have been way more well read over these some of these topics.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
still not where I feel it needs to be, but at least the momentum is kind of heading that way, right?
Well,
And so
what's
people,
interesting to me
yeah.
is that you point out that they're more well read, and I didn't even know there was enough info on this topic to be well read. So that's interesting to me that
So
there's like a movement, and I just have to pause and point out that Steve, our producer, brought to my attention that the player says drumming injury on Drum Talk TV. Should be drumming injury talk. I left an extra word in the graphic. So that just shows how freaking serious we are about this, right, Janice?
right.
But it's interesting that there's enough info out there for people to be well read. Wow, there's still things in motion, no pun intended, and I'm sure a lot of new information coming out, right?
There's a lot, there's a steady stream of information that's coming out. And I would say the first like really major music study or study that was done on professional musicians that kind of started the ball rolling was a study that was done in like back in the late 80s, I think like 1988 or something like that, where they surveyed over 2,000 professional orchestral musicians and asked them about their pain and their mental health and like what things they've tried, et cetera. So it's just a general survey, but that was the first really big study.
It surprises me that it was that long ago.
It was that long ago, but really it wasn't that long ago.
That's true.
And considering that, there's been almost 40 years in between like that first major study.
My daughter just had a heart attack, by the way, because one of them was born in 1980, and she's like, almost 40 years. I'm sure she's saying that. But considering
not quite 40 years.
Yeah,
but like
you're right. I mean, being that orchestral musicians have been around for a few hundred years, you know, 1988 was 2 weekends ago in that scope.
Exactly. And just like the amount of literature that's out on just like medical stuff or medical conditions overall, like 1988 is like a drop in the bucket, really, when we're talking about it. And so there's a steady stream of, areas of research that people are looking into. Nadia, who's been on, I have so much respect for her. She's like a great researcher, and she thinks about very relevant things that I think about, but I'm not smart enough to actually put that into research, and I don't have the patience for research. So I'm glad there's people like her that are. But yeah, I mean, it's coming along, and I would say that the literature on musician health isn't very vast. But one thing that I always talk about, and this is when I'm educating other PTs. So part of my mission is also to educate other health professionals on just things to look at with musicians, and then also, educating musicians on that part of it too, is that at least with the PT world or the medical world, we don't have a lot of literature on how to treat musicians specifically. But what we do have is a ton of literature on how to treat the human body. And we're all humans for the most part at the end of the day. So when we're talking for the most part. So when we're talking about how to treat tendonitis or how to treat nerve pain or how to treat
repetitive motion,
etc.
Even bassoon players. I mean, you don't have to move your limbs a lot to achieve a repetitive motion injury. Bassoon,
even just sustaining
flute,
that position
yeah,
for a long time. You're using those muscles repetitively for a long time.
Even on a micro state, right? Like valves on a wind instrument or whatever.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't even have to be motion, even just like holding something in a sustained position. And not just that, it's like how we learn. So musicians, I always say musicians are like master practicers, right? We pride ourselves on like practicing, and some musicians are like, oh, I practice like 4 hours a day, I practice 6 hours a day. But we're also horrible learners. Like we can make our practicing so much more efficient if musicians knew how our brains learn. And I will tell you.
Say that again, because I think that's really huge.
Yeah. So I forgot what I said.
About if musicians learn how our brains learn,
right, then you can actually make your learning and your memorization and your skill acquisition, your technique acquisition so much more robust and so much longer lasting if we knew how to approach practicing. And through that, you can also, and I tell musicians this all the time, you can also cut the amount of time that you spend practicing. It's not that you can't practice for 6 hours, but you can get the same, if not better, more quality amount of work and learning in like a period of an hour and a half than someone could just doing something over and over and over and over and over again in
Oh,
4 hours.
I love
And
this. So it's all about getting the right, if I could paraphrase in a way, get the better result in less time with the smarter work being done, in essence.
yeah,
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 I love that.
exactly.
With therefore less repetitive motion, less
Exactly. You
risk
see
to
how it all,
injury.
yep,
Yeah, it's a
yep.
domino effect.
It's
Yeah,
absolutely a domino
that's
effect. So that's
interesting.
something that I love talking to musicians about, because that in itself could be a whole game changer in terms of
Yeah,
how much someone actually spends in front of their instrument. And again, it's and the same thing with like building up stamina or building up strength. Like it's not that you can't play 4 hours or can't play 6 hours. You can train your body up to that, but you can't do it in those spikes that I see musicians do pretty
right.
much 99% of the time. Right. And
That's
so,
interesting. Yeah, and to me, we have a couple comments. I'm going to read a couple things here. But before we do that, to me, stamina, we can easily be fooled by stamina. You know, again, I'm 60. I've got great stamina. Thank goodness. I am blessed with great stamina. I could play for 2, 3 hours. Some crazy, insane, complicated music at a huge, obnoxious, progressive rock drum kit in my studio, though that could fool me into thinking I'm physically okay because I have the
yeah,
stamina to do so. But if I
right.
have the wrong ergonomics, if I'm reaching too far, if I'm playing too hard, I can easily acquire so many different injuries. We'll save that for another show. And some of the people I worry about the most when it comes to drums is not just being set up ergonomically incorrectly, but those who are in drumline and drum corps and marching band who are wearing harnesses and
Yep.
carrying weight. And not only
Yep.
are they in place, but then they're also
They're
moving
doing
and feeling
choreography
the
too. Yeah.
choreography, exactly what I was going
Yeah.
to say.
And it
Yeah,
keeps
so
getting crazier and crazier,
yeah,
those like
it's
marching
like
band.
when I think to when our kids were, well, I'll go to grandkids. Our grandkids, the youngest grandkids of the 19 so far, are they're okay, they're 7 years old to 23. I'm not carrying the 23-year-olds around anymore, but the 7-year-olds, yeah, once in a while, hey grandpa, get them. When I think of the weight of a 20, 30, 40 pound kid, or my dogs, let alone, at the vet, I got to pick them up, put on the examiner, to carry a drum around for a half-hour show or something is like, F that, I'm not doing it.
So yeah, so I did a quick research for one of my talks like several years ago, and one of those multi-toms that people wear,
Yeah,
they can be upwards to
tritoms,
like,
quints,
yeah,
quintuplets, whatever,
exactly. They
quads.
they can they can be upwards to like 40, 50 pounds.
Yeah, that's
Um,
crazy.
yeah. And you're most of the people who are in marching bands are like high schoolers and maybe like college,
Yeah,
maybe just a touch out of college, but you know that they're still growing at that point, and so you have that much load.
right.
You know that's a fair amount of load to have
And
to
honestly,
undergo.
there's not only no lessons on how to carry quads or quintuplets correctly, but the harnesses are generic. And
Yeah.
often they're hard molded harnesses, not made for
Well,
anyone in particular. So your
yeah.
body just has to deal
I
with
think
what's
the
put on
bigger
you.
issue is that most of these people who are in marching band, I know we're kind of like going off a path, but like most
That's
of
okay.
these people, yeah, I'm fine with it. Most of the people who are in marching band, they they start practicing in summertime, right? And but they're not doing anything in between to start conditioning themselves to a withstand a 2 hour long rehearsal, And then if you're in the elements, if you're like in the hot summer sun, it's humid, it's hot, they're not conditioning their bodies to withstand that.
Right.
And in addition to carrying, a heavy bass drum or a quad or like stuff
Yeah.
like that. And then you're having them do cardiovascular activity, running around from one end to the field to the
With the
next.
choreography and
It's
whatnot. Yeah.
And if they're not starting conditioning from the spring to prepare for that so that they can start rehearsing and practicing in the summertime, which, you have these marching bands like DCI and all of that, and then they're going to hit the summer and they might start off strong and they're all young. So, they have youth on their side, but
Yeah.
by the end of their rotation or the end of that tour, it's a rough go. So,
Yeah, I remember, like, I don't know how it is now, but for the short time I was part of that, and I say short time because I didn't like it. It wasn't fun, and I bailed. I've
yeah,
talked about this on Drum Talk TV before, that I bailed because it wasn't fun. The musical director, to his credit, I'm sure he was a genius in his area, but he didn't make it fun. And for me personally, music should be fun, not like being in the military. And it felt like being in the military, and I bailed.
right.
But I do remember that for the short time I was there, just like physical education back then, I wasn't told about electrolytes and how that affects your muscles and, conditioning for weather, like you're talking about dehydration, all those things. So,
Mm-hmm.
that's very much a point well taken. I want to address a comment here by um, Matt Huey says, nice. I'm a PT too. That's awesome. Lindsay McDonald. Hey, Lindsay, how's it going? Lindsay says, even bass drum in marching bands, right? Good, good, good. And I saw something by, I believe, Dowd Stevens. Let me see. Let me scroll up. I'm looking at my little monitor down here. Oh, I just saw Dowd. Yeah, Dowd Stevenson says, I got to get my, you know what? Sorry, folks. I put my Coke bottoms on. Dowd says, I ended up having carpal tunnel surgery on my left hand in 2019. I had surgery on my left and right ulnar nerve as well. Wow.
Ooh,
Hindsight is 2020. Take care of yourself. The most important part of my drum kit, aside from myself, is my drum throne. And then I got to click see more. I use a Porters and Davies BC2 and it works the best myself. I had this sort of aspect of that conversation a couple days ago with Levon Strand, who is a gentleman who's part of our universe that supplies backline kits for festivals and concerts and things. And we talked about that whole drum throne element that some drummers didn't even think to
yeah,
specify exactly what drum throne they need for a gig or bring
yeah,
their own. And that's so important because for a couple of reasons. One, your body's used to that throne. Is it oval? Is it circular? Is it a shovel shape? Is it the right height? Is it swivel? Is it hydraulic? If you're not used to hydraulic is weird. Your
yep,
body type and what you're used to sitting on, and those are two separate things, but if we just look at those together, and then all of a sudden you show up at a gig and they got something different, there's nothing worse than playing. It's like dancing in shoes that are two sizes too tight. If you're on the wrong, right?
totally.
If you're on the
Yeah.
wrong throne, you're sciatic, everything's out of whack, and you're supposed to enjoy, your body doing all this other ballet stuff. We need to think of those things. Those are very important things. Your
Well,
posture
another
and
way I would think about it too is like when you've mastered a piece or you've mastered a set list and you've kind of gotten it on automatic, if you introduce something, a new seat like suspension if or a seat shape, you're basically asking your body to relearn how to play that piece within the context of that new
that's a
adjustment.
brilliant point. Yeah, it's like okay, everybody watching, raise your hand if you've ever stayed at a hotel. Raise your hand. Okay. There's 1, 5, 17, 28, 30, 140. Okay, there's like 248 people raising their hand who have stayed in hotels. Every time I stay in a hotel that I don't bring my own pillow, I'm like
Yep.
telling my wife, I can't believe I forgot my, because never is the pillow right. It's the
Yep.
same thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a big thing for touring musicians too. So, obviously we talk about our equipment our instruments that we play on, and find consistency in whatever areas you can. So if it even like simple routine, daily routines, find a routine that you can stick to. Find a routine, your sleeping routine. Like, how do you wind yourself down for the night? Is it that you sleep with a standard pillow that you bring with you everywhere? Do you sleep with a sleep mask? Do you have like white noise going on, etc.? Like, the more you can keep it consistent, at least within yourself, no matter where you are, what time zone you're in, your body will recognize as that pattern to
Yes.
kind of match to that. And I know a lot of touring musicians who try and find something, like find some kind of routine. I know people who bring their own like coffee machines with them, and because that's like a
Yeah.
consistent thing for them. And that's great, so any
I
little
bring a
thing that you
bong.
can.
I bring a
I mean,
bong.
that's
Just
great too.
no, I'm
I
kidding.
mean,
I don't
I
anymore. But yeah, there's that thing. And you know what? When you said white noise, my brain went, oh my gosh, because my wife's been gone for 2 weeks and Enja has to have white noise. So she has this like portable fan that is
yeah.
on this part of furniture on her side of the bed. And we have 3 dogs that sleep in our room, and they're used to that too. So I noticed the first 3 days she was gone and took her freaking fan with her.
How
Thank you,
dare
baby.
she?
Yeah, it's like I remember the first night. It was I put the dogs down, I sprayed the lavender spray, and we all laid down. And all of a sudden, the 4 of us, I'm serious, me and the 4 dogs realized something was out of whack. And I sat up, and they all looked at me, and I said, yeah, mommy has the fan. And they all slowly drooped down into their beds. It was like, yeah, that because you get used to that stuff, as
Yeah.
simplistic as that sounds, it
Yeah.
has a lot to do with our gray matter, our psyche. It's not just the physical part, you
Yeah.
know. So
Totally.
that's really interesting to me. The throne, because let's face it, guitar players sit on a seat or a stool or a
Or
chair.
stand.
Drummers sit on thrones, okay? We sit on thrones. We're the kings and queens of rhythm. We sit on thrones. And when you don't take your throne with you, that's a huge risk, even if you're able to adjust every drum stand, cymbal stand, the tilt of every to your
Yeah.
liking. If you're sitting on something that's not your throne, that's a big risk of just being uncomfortable the whole time. There, whether you realize it or not, there's that subconscious, oh man, this is too hard. Oh, it doesn't move. It's not hydraulic.
hmm
Or what's with this thing? It is hydraulic. And I don't, it's a big deal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
For
I
sure.
would equate it to as a guitar or bass player, just someone throwing you a guitar on stage and it's got completely different
Different
action or
action. Yeah.
strings. Yeah. Same thing with a wind instrument having different valve settings and
Yeah.
just the
Right. Right.
motion.
The
It's this,
resistance, the action on their keys. Yeah.
yeah,
Definitely.
piano, even. It's the same
Yeah. Oh,
thing.
pianists are like a whole, because piano's similar to drummers. Like, you can't haul a piano with you if you're traveling from state to state or city to city. Like,
Unless you're Rick
you're gonna,
Wakeman. But
or unless you have like a digital keyboard or something, like you have keys with you. But like, if
yeah.
you're playing on an acoustic piano, like, it's anything is fair game, right?
Yeah.
The bench might be different, the action on the keys might be different, the
Yeah.
acoustics might be different. So
And your
it's
muscle memory is
yeah.
is expecting something different, or rather
Well,
it's expecting something the same. So when you introduce a replacement instrument that has any element that's different, it throws us off, and now we're focused on that rather than the music and
yeah.
expressing and all of that. Yeah.
So kind of going back to our original point is that there isn't a ton of literature on music specific stuff. There's a growing body of evidence, of course.
Okay.
But what we do know is about the human body and how we continue to adapt and adjust.
Right.
And so if you are a musician who does depend on backline equipment when you're traveling and touring, etc., maybe in your practicing when you're at home or when you're learning the pieces and trying to condition yourself up for that performance, that you play on as many different types of instruments, like different snares and different cymbals and different setups, different thrones as possible. So your body can become a little bit more robust in what it can still do. Exactly, adaptable. So how someone trains, if you're like a big budget tour where you can bring your own kit everywhere, you have the same throne, you have the same setup, you have your same tech guy who knows exactly how you like to have things adjusted, then play on that same setup all the time. But if you're someone who depends on backline gear to play these gigs, you might need to practice, if you have the accessibility to it, to practice on different drum heads, different cymbals, etc., so that your brain can be a little bit more malleable and adaptable, like what you said.
That's brilliant advice, because obviously, as the Drum Talk TV guy, I follow so many drumming groups, music groups, and I'm connected with so many musicians on Facebook and whatnot, that when I see someone say, what's the best drum pedal? What's the best pedal for this? My answer is, I'm going to take my filter off. It doesn't fucking matter. The skill is in your feet, not the hardware. And you've got to be able to be called up to a gig. If the Rolling Stones said, hey, come up and play Brown Sugar with us, doesn't matter what the setup is. You got to be able to get up on stage, sit down and play that setup. No matter who it is, no matter what the gear is, no matter how different it is from yours. And that's where we need to focus on our playability, adaptability, the flexibility, and exactly what you said, Janice, being able to just do what we do with different pieces of gear. About 20 years ago, I went to a Guitar Center, and for fun, I said, so at the time they had like 20 pedals, bass drum pedals against the wall with like a mounted bar that
nice.
Right? And I said, blindfold me, I want to check these all out. And I literally did a blindfold taste test, probably of about a dozen of those. They all were exactly the same to me, because I had the psychology imprinted in my brain that it was all about what I'm able to do with my feet. There was one pedal, I won't say what it was, but there was one pedal that felt like I was stepping in wet dog dew. And it was a very expensive name brand pedal. Other than that, I was able to with all of them all the same, because it was all in my feet. And I really want to inspire and encourage musicians, drummers, to take Janice's advice and be adaptable and be able to do what you do with no matter what you have to work with. Sorry, drum brands. Sorry, drummers. It's not about the gear. It's about your physical capabilities, your trainability, your muscle memory, your nerve memory, and being able to do what you do no matter what, right?
Yeah. And that's what I talk to musicians all about all the time, is like,
did you ever pick up a violin and a bow that wasn't yours and go, oh, wow, I can't play this? Of course not, right?
No. Yeah, right. But it's like you can have the most expensive setup, the best gear out there, but unless you have your body ready to perform that doesn't really matter, right?
Right.
And so a fantastic professional virtuosic ex-musician, whatever musician, instrumentalist, can probably pick up like a toy violin or a student violin or a student piano and still sound incredible and amazing compared to an amateur.
Yeah,
right?
A Hollywood Bowl worth performance on a toy violin, because it has to do with their skills.
Yeah. The instrument comes later. And yes, there are equipment is like the Lamborghinis of them all, like, right? And it does make playing much more enjoyable, much nicer, etc.
Yeah.
But you can still have great art playing on most other instruments. And so unless you take care of your body is the one that transmits your art into the instrument.
Right.
And that's what I hope musicians really start to kind of consider and think about.
Plus, your significant other will always appreciate you spending $122,000 on an 1858 Stradivarius violin. So there's that.
Right, there's that too.
I want to go back to comments. Joshua VP in Belgium. Joshua, what's happening, brother? Says, what's the best treatment for tendonitis? This is about the most asked question on forums, but I see not so great answers. So if thou will, there you go. Over to you, Janice. What's that all about?
Forums are a very interesting place to
A
live
bunch
in.
of maybe armchair quarterback type advice,
Ooh,
would you say?
yeah, there's a lot of stuff on the forums that I'm a member of like certain forums, and I just kind of sit back and I look anytime someone comes up with a health question. I'm just like, you can kind of run the gamut, right? It's like if you
Yeah.
ask your friends who aren't professionals or who aren't experts in that area, everyone has an opinion, and something could work for somebody. Other things could just be purely anecdotal, like, oh, I sprayed Windex, like my big fat Greek wedding. I sprayed Windex
Wait,
on
what?
my
Is that
big
real?
fat. No, it's a
Oh, okay,
movie.
good,
It's a movie
good.
reference. No, no, it's not.
I'm like, how am I going to get the Windex for my shoulder right now?
No, the joke in the movie is that
But
they
I
like
get it.
sprayed
Yeah.
Windex to like fix everything, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, funny.
So the thing with tendonitis is, tendonitis is typically an overuse injury. And so the tendon connects the muscle to the bone. So you have tendons on either end like if we're talking about like the biceps here, you have a tendon here and you have a tendon here. And so that's what transmits the force to cause movement. If you do it over and over again, that tissue, that tendon can get irritated if it's too severe, if it goes on long enough. You can actually get some like micro tears in the tendon, or you can get scar tissue that develops in the tendon. So tendonitis is kind of like the fresh injury, the acute injury. And so most of the time it can get, alleviated with rest. Some really gentle stretching is always advisable. And then once things calm down, you don't want to like strengthen a really hot and bothered tendon, because that's probably what got you there in the first place.
Oh.
But once things calm down, you can continue doing some like gentle stretches, maybe decrease the amount that you're playing or the intensity that you're playing for a period of time. And it just doesn't necessarily mean you have to like stop playing altogether. But just kind of decrease the intensity somewhat. And then once things calm down and things feel like not as painful or not as irritable, you can introduce what's called like eccentric strengthening, so if we're talking about our muscle or our biceps again, so the contraction of the biceps, this is a concentric contraction of the biceps where the muscle is shortening. So the muscle is kind of like pulling my arm towards it. So that's a concentric contraction. Eccentric is where the biceps is slowly controlling how quickly the elbow straightens out. So if I'm holding like a weight, like my cup, for example, I'm not just like dropping the cup down, right? I'm actually using my biceps to slowly lower it back onto the table.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so that's the kind of strength training that people who suffer from tendonitis eventually would benefit from, because you're elongating the fibers of the muscles and the tendons to kind of reorient themselves back into that like straight position.
On that note, thank you for that. On that note, and I'll get to comments, folks. Can you prove or dispel the theory that with tendonitis, does hot or cold treatment, do either of those help, or are they insequential, or what's the deal with that? Like, other than laying off and giving it a rest, is there other treatment, temperature wise or hydration or otherwise, that helps?
So the debate on hot and cold is still very alive these days.
Okay.
But what I will say is that if you have an acute injury, it's like a fresh injury, it just started within like the first couple weeks where it's like really irritable. Cold or ice is probably going to be your best bet.
Mm.
The debate out there is that, so the thought behind, because like the icing and injury has been around for like eons, right? So like people have been talking about, oh, you sprained your ankle, throw an ice pack on it.
Yeah. Or go do an
So
ice bath after a
yeah,
football
go do
game.
it. I mean, there's yeah. So the like kind of foundational thought is that ice causes constrictions of the blood vessels, so it kind of helps control swelling.
Mm-hmm.
What we also know is that ice can actually change or kind of temporarily modulate people's perception of pain in that area, because you're introducing another input. So it's like if you like whack your elbow on a doorway and you're like, oh, that like really hurts.
Oh, that
It's
hurt just.
it's kind of the same idea where you're kind of like almost like distracting those nerves that kind of got banged up when you
Yeah.
hit your elbow. And so your brain's thinking about like, or it's interpreting something else. So it's called a gating effect. So there's a gating effect when you're introducing ice or even heat into the area. So ice is kind of typically or historically been really good for kind of those acute injuries, those fresh injuries. The debate is that because we know that with swelling or with inflammation, there's actually like good components of inflammation in that kind of introduced into that area. So like the healing properties of inflammation.
Right.
So the current debate these days, and it always comes and goes, is like, do we really want to limit the amount of, that good inflammation so that it potentially delay healing? But in general, ice is always good. Ice can be used for either acute or chronic issues. When in doubt, ice is fine. Heat is really good for if you have like a muscle spasm, or if you have kind of like longer injuries, maybe like it's been around for like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and even beyond.
But not necessarily inflammation, obviously, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Because heat does the opposite of ice, where it dilates the blood vessels, so it brings in more blood flow into the area. Mm-hmm. And so if you have swelling in an area, or you have swelling in your wrist from tendonitis, or you have inflammation, you don't want to introduce more fluid or more blood into that area, because that swelling could actually put more pressure on the joint, which could kind of compound that inflammatory process. So heat is really good for kind of like once you've moved beyond the swelling, once it's like no longer feeling warm to touch, or you have a muscle spasm. So people oftentimes have like tightness in their neck or like headaches. Right. Heat can be really, really great for, at least alleviating or like kind of temporarily calming down those areas.
Interesting. This reminds me that now that I think of it, and I'm sure Stephen, our producer, would agree, that George Costanza is the poster boy for constricted blood vessels, because he understands shrinkage with cold, when he says, I was in the pool. So that all makes sense. No, I seriously though, I think it's really important that we do understand how temperature affects our blood vessel flow or not. Mm-hmm. That affects what is happening, whether it's swelling or, like you said, once we get past that and everything. So that's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to look at comments. Sure. Lindsay says, hi, Lindsay. Again, how are you, dear? She says, thank you, Janice Ying. What is the best advice for drummers with large drum kits? There's some more comments. I'll get to them, folks. But I want to tag something onto that. I think there's a caveat with that. What is the best advice for drummers with large drum kits? Well, those of you who follow Drum Talk TV and may have seen my show, Dan's Almost Daily Vlog, where I play on my big, most of the time I'm on my big, obnoxious, progressive blue kit rather than the small, compact, conservative jazz kit. I think that partly with that question, Janice, depends, of course, a lot on how is it set up. You know, my over the years, if you look at my blue drum kit from 20-ish years ago, stuff was much more spread out, if I may, whereas now it's all much more conservative, compact, brought in. There's a lot more economized motion for me to get from A to Z, wherever Z is, used to be farther away. And I have found it to be easier to play, less strain on my body, and the fact that it's just more comfortable. And it really took me adapting more of an open mind to set up more for my playing than, oh, that looks great.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Right.
go ahead and chime in on that regarding
Yeah,
Lindsay's
I'd love
question.
to. Actually, when I give talks to PTs, because PTs, a lot of PTs don't know about what musicians do, but one of my favorite slides that I always, when I'm doing these kind of talks, is that PTs know about ergonomics. And most people know about, like, oh, how do you set up your desk to maximize efficiency and workflow, et cetera. So there's like a kind of this classic image of someone's like computer workstation, where you have, so I like to think about it, where you have, if your arms are down by your side, resting naturally by your side, anything that you can kind of like reach in this area is
Yeah.
kind of like your most frequent work, right? So you think about your snare, your hi-hat, etc. You can not even like reach with your arm and still be able
It's just
to
there.
function there. It's just there,
Yeah.
right? So
That's
that
great.
first arc, or that first like kind of semicircle, is kind of like the most frequent area. If you straighten out your arms a little bit, and for drummers, you think about, it's not just your hands, but then like the extent, like your stick too, right? So
Yeah.
your stick is an extension of your hand. And so that second arc, so you have a wider semicircle around that, right? And so that would be your occasional zone of work. So maybe 50-60% of the time you're not functioning there, but you can get there fairly easily, and you can use that moderately frequently and still be comfortable, right?
Yeah.
And then beyond that, so there's 3 semicircles. So that third semicircle beyond is like the very rarely and almost never circle. And so when
Ah.
you really have to reach, you're not doing it frequently over and over and over again. Because then you would, if you have like a big cymbal or a big crash cymbal where overhead and it's beyond your reach, you're going to have to change your body, and change your base of support to get to that. And if you're doing it over and over and over again, then you might consider moving it into that occasional semicircle.
Right. Otherwise, it
Um,
affects your entire physicality, right?
Yeah, and think about, it's not just like the arc, but each person has different flexibility too. And so thinking about, okay, if someone doesn't have as much rotation in their arm, they, instead of a full 180 semicircle, it might need to be maybe like 160 or something like that,
Right.
to kind of fit their abilities.
I remember in May, and there's videos out there, folks. I remember in May, our Drum Talk TV 10-year anniversary show. The kit I played for that show was not my personal kit, and it was set up for the most part very ergonomically for me. It was a John Bonham kit. My band played all Led Zeppelin stuff, so it was a 5-piece. However, the tom up here was a bit high for me, and I could only adjust it so much, but I was adaptable. It was okay. However, and yes, folks, I have timpani drums with my big kit. My timpani drums are probably 6 inches lower than the timpani drums used in that show. And if
Mm.
you see those videos, the camera that's about right here, back in that corner, catching me this way from behind, you could see that when I go over to do the fills and I incorporate the tympanies, my elbows are really high because
Yeah.
the surface was about probably here rather than literally where this desk is. That's a huge difference if your body's been playing here for 40 years and all of a sudden for one night you're playing here. It
Yeah.
just changed my whole posture and
Totally.
everything. I was able to adapt, but I must admit, physically, it felt awkward. It felt weird.
But imagine if you were to play a whole tour with backline stuff that only had that high
Right.
setup,
And I
right?
didn't have that set up for the rehearsal the day before. I didn't
Correct.
have the
Yeah.
timpani drums. I just figured, yeah, I don't need them for the rehearsal. I should have had
Yeah.
them just for the get used to playing.
Right, right, right.
But those little nuances can often make the biggest difference in how we play, how we feel, and most importantly,
Absolutely.
how it affects us physically. I want to look at comments one more time before we go. Bill, sorry, folks. Gosh, what an old guy. Bill, I think it said Taggart. Let me go back to you, Bill. Wow, there's all kinds of comments here. Okay. Bear with me, folks. Bill Taggart, I got it right with the other glasses. Bill says, my tip after 50 years of playing would be to sit a little higher as you get older. Let gravity work for you. I think that's sage advice. I think the caveat with that, I should put these back on. There's more comments. The caveat would be depending on your body type. Because again, I'm only 5'7" now, and I'm pretty proportioned. But I know people my height or a little taller that some have longer torsos versus shorter from the waist down, and the opposite, longer legs and a shorter torso. So it really does depend on how not just our core body is shaped, but the length of our arms. And there's just so many factors. You really got to experiment. And the important thing I think in what Bill says is, and I'm sure, Janice, you can speak to this, as our body changes, we need to not be stuck in how we set up and played 30 years ago. For
Right.
you youngsters, your body will change. We have to not be stuck in how we played 30 years ago, but watch, feel, and listen to our body and how it changes. Even if our size doesn't change, thank goodness I
Hmm.
have not put on weight in about 40 years. But for those who do, our posture might change and the way we sit and just, imagine, I know people my age in their 60s that weigh 40, 50 pounds more than they did 20 years ago. That changes your posture and your physicality and everything else.
Totally.
We need to pay attention to that. So I'm just going to, before we go, grab a couple more comments. Dowd also says, or is that this? That's the same one. Thanks, Dowd. Knick-knack, paddywhack, step on your mom. He says, all that weight comes crashing down in a repetitive motion. Dowd confirms, absolutely. Playing at the proper height can be crippling. And in the 1990s, Modern Drummer had an article on playing at improper height and how damaging it can be to the body. The interesting thing to all of that is, and then we'll wrap it up so we can fit this on Instagram. But the interesting thing about the word proper is that it's different for all of us. There's no matrix or scale. We
Yeah.
kind of have to figure it out. And fortunately, hopefully, to shows like this, we can get some advice that say, if you're sitting so that your knees are higher than your waistline, maybe you need to raise your butt a bit. If your butt is too high, like I used to sit years ago, because I copied one of my favorites, the late, great, bless his heart, Alan White, sat almost like he was sitting on a high stool.
Yeah.
That posture ended up not being right for me. And when I just simply experimented and lowered my butt a bit lower, it just felt more comfortable. So don't be afraid to F around with your
Yeah.
setup and your posture and your reach and all those
Yeah.
things. Don't just set up for how it's going to look from 50 feet away. Set up so you'll be healthy, reduce injury risk. And
And just yeah, sorry to interrupt, but
no, go
just
for it. Yeah.
as someone is kind of experimenting with ergonomics and their setup, is just realizing that every time you change one thing, so if you're changing the height of your throne, for example, that's gonna change
Where
like
everything
other
else is.
things
Yeah.
for better or for worse. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, but there's a consequence for every change that you make. So it's you might need to make kind of multiple adjustments until you kind of find that sweet spot.
Yeah.
It's not just
Absolutely.
about changing your chair or your throne or changing the height of your symbol or changing the height of etc. So
Yeah.
there might be other small adjustments that need to be made along the way until you find what works the best.
And they could be little adjustments. It doesn't mean
Yeah.
you have to rearrange your kit or
Oftentimes it's the little ones. It's not a huge overhaul or anything like that.
right. Awesome. Folks, thank you so much for following Janice Ying and myself on Drum Talk TV and Drumming Injury Talk, which overflows into every instrument as we talked about, whether it's the action on your bass, your guitar, your violin, your cello, your viola, the valves on your bassoon, your flute, whatever it is, you are at risk if you play an instrument. So be mindful of how do things feel while you're playing. If it feels uncomfortable, don't feel like you have to accept that because, well, this is how it is and I want to play this instrument. It's not always the case. So thanks for following what we do. We'll be back with more with Janice Ying on Drumming Injury Talk on Drum Talk TV. Janice, hang on the line for a few minutes after we say goodbye to the audience, which reminds me to, say goodbye to the audience. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.